David, thanks for coming on the show today. You have a book that you've recently released called Red Flags. Can you tell us a little bit about the premise of the book?
Thanks for having me on, Tom. Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left is a book which really sets out to try to examine the so-called socialist societies like the USSR and the other societies that were built along that model, and asks the question, were these societies in transition to communism? It also talks about the political tradition of Marxism-Leninism, which is associated with those societies, and also with the alternative tradition of anti-Stalinist communism, and asks the question about what's the future of small c communist politics.
Right now, what was your motivation for writing the book?
So, yeah, it's a good question. I guess a number of years back now, close to a decade, I began to notice the spread of on the left of attitudes that were sympathetic or more actually favorable towards the so-called socialist societies. And, the subset of that is tanky politics that, listeners in the UK will know from, the Communist Party of Britain and other groups like that, the ones that actually kind of retro neo-Stalinist kind of politics. But I think there's a broader trend. It's not just those politics. This is that kind of attitude that says those societies weren't so bad, or just responding to anti-communism of our times, which is of course a real problem that people do need to respond to, but doing it in a way that doesn't subject those societies to a radically emancipatory egalitarian critique. So eventually, when I had the opportunity to write, I thought this would be something worth tackling.
Right, can you say a little bit about the anti-communism today?
Yeah, the ideology of anti-communism really is another way of pounding the message that there is no alternative to capitalism. And in fact, any attempt to radically change society will allegedly lead to a totalitarian nightmare, like the worst of the so-called socialist societies' experiences. So anti-communism really is an ideology that defends the status quo, and we can see this all the way back to its origins. If you look at the response to the Paris Commune in the late 1800s, it can go through a response to the Russian Revolution and so on. Since then, it's morphed in some ways, but that's still the same essential message of anti-communism. And that's the dominant ideology. So when you comes to what people learn in school, what people see in most of the mainstream media about the history of these kinds of societies, it's the idea that the Russian Revolution led directly to the Gulag. All this kind of thing is central, and the conclusion that's always drawn is that these are horrible experiences of the past, these horrors, and we should not attempt to radically change society today.
So, what was like the Bolshevik then conception of communism, like prior to the revolution?
To talk about Bolshevism, we have to understand that the Bolshevik Party, so the party that ended up leading the Russian Revolution, was originally a party that saw itself, and was a wing of the Russian Marxist movement that was very much part of what we could call Second International Marxism. So the Second International was the socialist international of organizations of parties that was created in the late 19th century. And its political practice was purely or overwhelmingly electoral, right? Trying to run in elections. And the idea would be that these parties would eventually be able to take state power, i.e., win election to parliament, to form governments and take over the existing state and use this as the tool for the transformation of society. And in the context of the Tsarist Empire, the Bolsheviks attempted to apply the politics which they got from parties like the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was the leading party in the Second International, to the situation where they had there was no capitalist democracy. So they couldn't do what the Germans were doing, or what people in France or Britain or elsewhere were doing. But they saw themselves as orthodox defenders of that theory, that politics. As an aside, the question of the relationship between Second International Marxism and the actual ideas of Marx and Engels is another whole question. But just briefly to say, this ideology of the Second International took elements of the thought of Marx and Engels, but also this other kinds of intellectual strands. And there was this orthodoxy built called Marxism, but there were significant differences between those ideas and those of Marx and Engels. So then in 1914, with the coming of the First World War and the fact that most of the parties, the leaders of most of the party, the Second International, supported their respective ruling classes in that inter-imperialist war, that led to a huge break on the part of the Bolshevik leadership, above all Lenin, with that. So with those politics, it was a sense that the Second International had betrayed its mission. So this led to some rethinking. But right up until 1917, right until the revolution actually broke out in Russia, the Bolsheviks had always assumed, it argued, that the coming revolution in Russia against the Tsarist autocracy, against the empire, would be a revolution the aim of which would be to overthrow the monarchy and then open up a period of capitalist development. So they saw it as a bourgeois revolution, not a revolution that was going to be one that opened up the possibility of a transition towards communism, because they argued, in line with Second International and basically universally understood Marxist orthodoxy, there was no material basis in a country with a very low level of development of the productive forces for a transition towards that kind of society. This then began to change in 1917, when the revolution actually broke out. The Bolsheviks came to the conclusion that their previous formula about how the revolution would be made by workers and peasants but would stop at the limits of a capitalist republic, that this had been overtaken or shown to be in practice wrong. And so that, in fact, there was the possibility, in fact, that the revolution would have to, if it was going to succeed, have the working class actually take power and would go beyond the limits of capitalism. At the same time, they recognized that they could not carry out a transition to communism in the context of their society. So it would only be through revolutions spreading internationally and aid from more advanced revolutions that would succeed in more advanced countries in Western Europe that would make possible their own survival. So the Bolsheviks they understood the goal of replacing capitalism with social ownership, and they talked about planned production. But I think that because their focus was always on the struggle against the monarchy, in that context, an actual socialist revolution was not in foreseeable future. A lot of questions were not clarified, and I think there were probably different ideas amongst the Bolsheviks, especially after 1917, about what the transition to communism would be about, and so on. So that's, I think, important to understand, because the Bolsheviks recognized, they did not have any sense. They had no idea of what they would be doing after the working class took power, because this was an unforeseen set of circumstances. There's some fascinating evidence that historians have turned up. For example, Simon Pirani has a very good book called The Russian Revolution in Retreat, in which there's a letter that was sent by a member of the Bolshevik Party who was resigning from the party. This is several years after the revolution, either during or after, I think after the Civil War had ended, in which this member says, "I will not worship this great god they call the state," or words to that effect, and having the sense that Bolshevism had become really distorted, and there had been this kind of stateolatry, worship of the state, which just suggests that there were quite different ideas about state power and its relationship to the communist project that were there in the ideas of the working class militants who actually made up the party in its early years. But I don't read Russian, so there are limits to what I've been able to excavate about that. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, so like one of the really good things about your book is that sometimes we I think we come from a similar kind of space where we're talking about the emancipation of the working class and the workers themselves controlling their own lives and their means of production, and control the conditions of production. And sometimes people can look at, from our kind of political viewpoint, can look and kind of nearly disparage the Russian Revolution in some sense. And what you bring to it in the book is that you kind of really talk about the material forces, in that society that kind of drove it to where it went. This was really good. Do you want to kind of talk about those forces that caused the revolutionary impulse to degenerate into what became a kind of an authoritarian state?
I'll take a stab at that, but before that, I should just mention one thing which I should have mentioned earlier, which is that if listeners have never read Hal Draper's essay, The Two Souls of Socialism, I think it's worth a read or reread, in terms of looking at kind of, I think, a way that's still refreshing at the history of the socialist left, to be able to understand what was original about Marx and Engels and how they fused together communism with radical democratic politics in a way that was different from previous communists, but then how this was not consistently and well understood by most of their followers or would-be followers after that. And it's interesting to think about the Bolshevik experience in relation to that too. But so the Russian Revolution, so you have this extraordinary revolution, and I should just summarize for listeners who may not know this history. So this was a revolution where there was an extraordinarily high degree of working class self-organization in 1917. Working class is a very small percentage of Russian society, but workers' councils, factory committees, unions, militias, other forms of organization, highly democratic, bubbling up, and an extraordinary process of collective self-transformation that working people went through in the course of the events of 1917. And as the people discovered their own collective power through the struggle to change society, and increasingly drew radical conclusions. And the Bolsheviks played a really important role in that. But then you have the society that experiences an extraordinary social catastrophe with the beginning of the onset of the Civil War that broke out in the year after the revolution. So just to give one example, the city of Petrograd, St. Petersburg, now 1917, something like 2.3 million people, at least in that city. By June of 1918, was under 1.5 million. So a very large minority of the city just gone, as people were leaving, the urban areas in order to either go back to the countryside if they had ties to the villages, or they were going into the military to fight to defend the revolution, or they were involved in some way in state administration for the new state that it was being created. So a country that had already suffered enormously through World War I, now experiencing this kind of social breakdown in lots of ways. And so I think if we don't understand that, and don't understand the conditions, conditions of famine, disease, and devastation that the Civil War brought, we can't understand what happened to the revolution. I think that's fundamental. So that you have a suspension of the socialist democracy that had briefly been created by the revolution. And this is true, by the way, in areas that were under anarchist control. This is the way it was under, in the areas that were under Bolshevik control. Just that the conditions for a thriving democracy of the exploited just were being taken away. So essentially, the revolutionary forces did succeed in winning the Civil War against the forces of counter-revolution, but in the process, the original revolutionary democracy really ceased to exist. The Bolsheviks party, which had a thriving internal democracy to the extent that that was still possible in the wartime conditions. Then after, at the end of the war, 1921, there's a ban on factions even within the party, which was a really unfortunate move. And you have the growing power of the party apparatus over the party as a whole. So the Bolshevik Party, which had been a revolutionary party, but that had thrown together a new state in the context of defending the revolution against counter-revolution, had ended up creating a situation where you had the revolutionary leadership ruling, but not subject to any kind of democratic control from the working class, which it had come to lead. And so I call this in the book, the state, a surplus extracting state of proletarian origin, which is a bit of a mouthful. But the idea was that, this was an improvised state that was extracting surplus labor from workers and from peasants in order to defend the revolution. But it wasn't subject to democratic control by the people in whose name it claimed to rule. And so that created the conditions then where that what had originally been a ruling layer of the working class committed to world revolution became a new ruling class. Because after the unexpected happened, so they both won the Civil War, they succeeded in defeating the counter-revolution, but this is crucial, the revolution didn't spread. There were no revolutionary victories in Western Europe that could come to their aid. And so they were really trying to square the circle, clinging to power in the hope that there would be this, this rescue. And then when it became clear that there wasn't going to be in the short term a revolutionary breakthrough elsewhere, then there began to be all sorts of changes. And so that the dominant layer within the leadership adopted the slogan of socialism in one country, which really was a ideological way of articulating the focus on just do what we can to do national economic development within the borders that we control. Industrialization was the project, but initially it was going to be industrialization that was quite slow and really constrained by the need to preserve a relationship, as non-antagonistic a relationship as possible, with the peasant majority of the society. But the question was always there, where were the resources going to come from to industrialize this country? And really, there was no way ultimately to bring about significant industrialization without ramping up the exploitation of workers and peasants. And so eventually, in response to, and you can think about it as both pressure, international pressure from Western European capitalist states, which were hostile to the Bolsheviks or the communist state, communist with the capital C, Communist Party state in Russia, and then antagonism with the working class and the peasantry. The working class still had very significant rights in terms of rights on the job, those kinds of worker protections, even if they didn't have democratic rights to control society. And the peasantry still had control of the land. So those rights for workers and peasants, very significant constraints on what the party state elite could do. And ultimately, at the end of the 1920s, there's what was called the Great Break, as the party state leadership turned towards hyper-industrialization, and eventually, didn't take very long, towards the forced so-called collectivization of agriculture. So this was a way of actually ramping up exploitation of the direct producers, both urban and rural. And when that happened, that ruling layer, that ruling elite had by that point crystallized at that point into a new ruling class.
So, what was the justification for that led to the destruction of democracy within the Bolshevik Party itself? Like, what was their reasoning for the banning internally of factions?
This was the idea that we have to, essentially pull together, because of this hostile, hostile and difficult situation we're in. That there had been, vigorous debates, even through the Civil War, but. And you can, with hindsight, one can argue that in fact there should have been a political opening after the end of the Civil War rather than a closing. But the conclusion that majority of the Bolshevik leadership drew was that there had to be a restriction in order to hang on, because of course, they had not been rescued by revolution elsewhere, and so conditions were really still quite dire. There was a whole process of making a virtue of necessity. So I think all sorts of things that were initially forced on the Bolsheviks by circumstances, in 1918, 1919, then eventually kind of codified as principles and used and rationalizations for anti-democratic practices, which, so you had these, I think, quite spurious arguments that were made, but we need to understand them as flawed responses to very dire conditions.
What was the effects of the dispossession of the peasantry and the forced collectivization?
So it was devastating. What happened at the end of the 1920s was much, much worse than what had happened during the Civil War. So during the Civil War, there certainly had been forced extraction of peasant production to feed the cities and feed the Red Army. But because and remember, the peasants had basically in 1917 seized effective control of the land, which, that was the key objective of peasants, right? Basically get the landlords off our backs and allow us to farm in peace. But as a result of this process, we need to really put collectivization in quotation marks. I mean, this is not what we would today, most people would understand by collective anything. This was the dispossession of the peasantry. And the result was was above all famine. The state officialdom interpreted peasant efforts to retain some of their own grain for their own subsistence as sabotage of the state's plans. And so the state did not, and contrary to what anti-communists would say, the state did not set out to cause mass starvation, but nonetheless, the result of the forced collectivization process was several million people dying in famines. And this was not exclusively in Ukraine. So Ukraine was hit extremely hard, but there were other regions that were hit too. But what was different about Ukraine was that peasant resistance in Ukraine was interpreted by the ruling class as Ukrainian nationalist opposition to the central state. And so, then a particularly harsh policy followed as a result of that. There's some serious demographic estimates about the number of excess deaths if you look between 1928 and 1938. So this is, if you look at the number of people, that if the demographic trends in 1928 had continued to 1938, and then you compare what that projection was to what actually happened, there's a gap of some 10 million excess deaths, which is a huge number of people, both adults and children. So it's from starvation, from disease, at least 700,000, probably closer to 1 million people executed, people who were killed in so-called industrial accidents during the hyper-industrialization process, and so on. But that gives you some sense of the toll, certainly above all from what was done to the peasantry, but also more broadly across society.
And what was driving the Great Purges from, say, 37, I think, to 41?
So the Great Purges, which have certainly become well known in literature and so on, because of just how horrifying it was to have the state security service show up and take people away, and executions and so on. It took about 700,000 lives. This was an attempt by Stalin, and above all, he was the supreme leader and people around him, to really crush any possible resistance to their leadership. And I think it really, to eliminate most of the remaining people who had been veterans of Bolsheviks who'd been in 1917 in the revolution, even though by this point, it had been many years since oppositionists had been jailed, sent to camps and so on, and special settlements. So these people who were being rounded up by 1937 were people who were not previously targeted as being disloyal. But anybody who actually might remember what 1917 had really all been about was being eliminated in this. But then it also, there was with the level of paranoia and so on that was set off by this process, it really kind of got out of control. People turning in other people and out of fear and so on. So, we shouldn't think about this as some kind of a coolly, rationally planned operation. It had a monstrous kind of dynamic of its own as well. But I think that certainly those were important factors in what was happening. And it was a self-inflicted injury on the ruling class, in the sense that they executed so many military commanders and so on, that subsequently put the Russian military at a real disadvantage when eventually they had to go to war, but against Nazi Germany. But yeah, that's what I would say about 1937-38.
My friend Donald, who I'm writing a book with on socialist planning and political economy, he was saying, he's living in Russia now at the moment, and he was saying, there was some internal Soviet order where they had a target for the number of executions per week or per day. It's really kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah, there were quotas. Yeah, and of course I should also mention that all the people, almost every single person who'd been part of the anti-Stalinist Marxist oppositions, people who by 1937 were in prison or in isolator camps and so on, they were all shot, executed in that, almost without exception, in those years. But that was a small percentage. That's just a few thousand people out of some 700,000 people who were killed.
So what can we say then about the class composition of Soviet society?
So if we want to do a class analysis of the kind of society that took shape after the late 1920s, we need to see that the central political bureaucracy of the party state was really the ruling class. It appropriated surplus labor from workers and dispossessed former peasants in the so-called collective farms, and then it determined how that surplus labor would be used, for what purposes it would be used, in terms of its project, which I think has aptly been called a project of a modernizing counter-revolution. So it was industrialize and modernize the society at breakneck speed in response to the geopolitical competition that it faced with more powerful Western states. The working class experienced alienated labor, so people were selling their ability to work in exchange for wages. They were dispossessed proletarians, and they had no way of organizing themselves independently and collectively to defend their own interests. Unions had been turned into organizations for the ramping up of productivity and the distribution of social benefits. They had absolutely no democratic control over how much of the labor of society, how much of their own labor would go towards producing for their own consumption, and how much of it would go to other purposes, which is a central question. And this was true both for urban workers and the rural working class and the so-called collective farms and state farms. So that's the core social relation then within the society that built the so-called socialist society.
Yeah, you had some interesting stuff in there on like the role of like bonuses and punishments used like to extract labor. You had one that really struck me, was like in 1938, penalties of dismissal and loss of housing for being more than 20 minutes late for work, eviction for workers who like quit their jobs without permission. These are pretty harsh conditions for the worker state.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really good book by Filtzer called Soviet Workers and Stalinist Industrialization. And if anybody's interested in following up on the details, he really looks at that. So there were, these very harsh methods that management was using. And to understand this, of course, we have to recognize that the state was trying to mobilize all labor. They were trying to get all the, human labor power they possibly could and use it for this project of industrialization, modernization. And so, when some people who are defenders of these societies say, well, there was no unemployment. Yes, there's no unemployment because the working class was herded into, these enormous construction projects, and huge new factories and mines and power stations and so on. But of course, because labor was needed, they couldn't use unemployment as a whip to discipline workers. So the only way that they could actually try to get people to work was through, on the one hand, try to motivate them in a positive sense by saying they were taking part in socialist construction, right? So there was a whole attempt to motivate self-sacrifice. So you're doing this to build a new society, but that doesn't go so far. It doesn't only goes so far. So then, yes, there's that's the carrot, and there's some bonuses and so on that are available for people. But then there's also a very big stick to try to beat people into, coerce people into production. Certainly in the 1930s, those were quite intense.
It's interesting, sometimes when we look back at the history, people can say, oh, well, this person made this decision and they made the wrong decision at this time, and it can be very idealistic, I think, in some sense. But like when we look back at the failure of the revolution, would you think it's fair to say that despite all its vibrancy and everything in the early days, that there was actually not enough organization of the working class and the peasantry towards a kind of common understood kind of socialist goal? Or do you think it's more circumstances playing in that came to just destroy it? Like, did they have the organizational forces in the working class and the peasantry to make communism a reality?
Well, I think with hindsight, I think crucially, we can recognize that it was impossible to carry out a transition to communism in the context of Russia, right? 1917, 1918. The only way that the way out, the thing that might have changed the whole course of history, was if a revolution elsewhere had broken through for more than a brief period of time in Germany or another country that could have relieved the forces in Russia. That was the great gamble that they had made. And of course, there were all sorts of limitations to the politics of the revolutionary working class in 1917 and so on. But I think that it's not that it was not irrelevant in terms of the weakness problems in theory and so on. But the working class was extraordinarily well organized. Now, it was uneven, so that there was, and crucially in workplaces, worker self-management was only established in a relatively small percentage. There were weaker, less developed forms of workers' control elsewhere. And certainly we can say the Bolsheviks didn't sufficiently understand the importance of worker self-management, although, again, there were different points of view. But I think the thing that crucially shaped the whole trajectory of the process after 1917 was the context of counter-revolution, which we should remember there were all sorts of foreign armies involved in that process. It wasn't just domestic. Forces from Britain, Canada, the U.S., many other countries were involved in that. And just the limits on what could be done in a society which was mostly made up of peasants who, once they had taken over the land, they had no interest in a transition towards communism. They were interested in establishment of subsistence agriculture so they could continue their way of life. And the urban and rural working class was only a small percentage of society. So, yeah, I guess that's how I would think about that question.
To what extent was production within the peasant communes kind of communal in the revolution and the post-revolution period? Or was that a small minority of the cases?
Yeah, I'm not a specialist in agriculture, so I'd have to refresh my memory on that. But certainly the Russian peasant commune that was much subject to discussion and debate in the 19th century, had been, I think, severely weakened by the time you get to the revolution. But you do have, when peasants are rising up and overthrowing landlord power in 1917, you do have all sorts of communal forms that are there. But I don't think I can say much that's helpful on the specificity of that.
I suppose we should say a little bit about the geopolitics then that the Soviet Union played with respect to the working class more generally across the globe.
Right. So from the end of the 1920s on, this paramount concern of the rulers in the USSR was the security of their own state, not the promotion of any kind of revolution at all. And you can see a whole number of examples. everything from how in the early 1930s, Stalinist leadership through the Communist International, the Organization of Revolutionary Parties that had been created in 1919, that was under the control of the rulers of the USSR. The policy of the Communist International was one which refused to promote the formation of a united front of working class forces to prevent fascism from coming to power in Germany. And then after that disaster, the line swung towards the so-called Popular Front approach, which was really all about the USSR trying to form a diplomatic alliance with Britain and France against Germany. And then within countries where you had communist parties, the promotion of a front which would ally the so-called allegedly progressive wing of the capitalist class all the way through to communists in a kind of grand alliance against fascism. But of course, that kind of alliance could only be created and maintained if no demands were raised or methods of struggle were used that would actually scare away the so-called progressive capitalists. And we saw the result of what that meant in above all in Spain. So the Spanish Revolution that broke out in 1936, you have a civil war and revolution in response to the fascist coup attempt in Spain. And you have workers who'd taken control of their workplaces and peasants who were collectivizing the land, engaged as well in this anti-fascist war against the forces led by Franco. But the line that was promoted by the USSR and by the Spanish Communist Party was one which said we have to essentially suppress, do away with this revolution in order to have the Popular Front alliance against fascism, which led to the repression of anti-Stalinist Marxists and anarchists in Spain. That's a very brief and compressed summary of what happened in a couple of years. And then you could see how the USSR, having failed to construct this alliance against Germany, then in 1939 signed a treaty with Nazi Germany, which then actually led to the USSR supplying Germany with all sorts of valuable resources, which the German state used at the beginning of World War II, in fact, right up to when it went to war in 1941 against the USSR. And in that period between 1939 and the attack on the USSR by Germany in 1941, the Communist International downplayed anti-fascism. So the guiding thread that runs through this and through the policies of the USSR after the Second World War, it's always about how the rulers of the USSR are attempting to preserve their own rule and different tactics that they employ towards that, rather than any kind of revolution. Certainly not social revolution of the kind that happened in 1917, but not even a revolution that would create a society like the USSR for the most part. Because revolution was instability and so on, and that was not what they were in. That's not what they wanted.
Yeah, you had some very interesting kind of tidbits of information there that I'd never heard before. One of them was you said that the USSR deported exiled communists back to Nazi Germany, and this was prior to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Like, I found that really shocking, and also it's like you mentioned as well, which I did not know, is that Stalin tried to convince Mao not to try out socialism, just to have a bourgeois revolution. That I was not aware of.
Yeah, the USSR was trying to sign a pact, trying to do a treaty with the nationalists against whom Mao was and the communists in China were fighting in the mid 1940s. Then subsequently, basically constantly preaching caution and going slow. And even once they did take power, overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party came to power, cautioning them against trying to establish a society along the lines of the USSR in China. So that kind of conservatism was pretty stark.
We've talked a good bit about the Soviet Union, and we mentioned at the top of the interview, we mentioned that word ML, Marxist Leninist, and I think we kind of haven't really defined the term yet. I was wondering if you could define for our listeners, if they're not that familiar with the term, what its main tenets would be.
So I think the first thing is to say that Marxism-Leninism is not contrary to what some people might think. It's not just the ideas of Marx and the ideas of Lenin. We can talk about those ideas, but really Marxism-Leninism is an ideology that develops in the 1920s as the ideology of the ruling layer in the USSR, its own kind of state ideology. And so this is an ideology which has puts an enormous emphasis on the role of the leading party. It's a rationalization of the role of the party in the USSR at the time, and it understands socialism in terms of state ownership of the means of production. That's what it's all about, and that industrialization. And has a conception of, it's like a crude materialism, which on the one hand emphasizes the limits on what humans can do because of the conditions they find themselves in, but on the other hand, a kind of a voluntarist dimension that emphasizes the amazing accomplishments which can be carried out by a revolutionary minority, a revolutionary leadership. So it's this kind of combination of crude materialism on the one hand and a kind of idealist voluntarism on the other. And at different times, Marxist-Leninists have emphasized one dimension of that ideology more than the other, depending on circumstances and emphases. But this then became incredibly influential as an ideology because it was within the USSR, it was taught, state publishing house produced tomes of social science that was conveying these kinds of this kind of ideology. But this was all these kind of things were exported, textbooks and so on, internationally and translated into many, many languages. And so all sorts of radicals around the world came to, as a theory, came to Marxism-Leninism because this was such an influential approach, influential ideology that was associated with what people widely saw as the first socialist country in the world. And so historically extremely influential ideology, but based on very selective use of aspects of the ideas of Marx and Engels and Lenin, and the active suppression of all sorts of other ideas. So that's Marxism-Leninism in a nutshell.
Yeah, you had a very good, I think it was a really good phrase where you said it was kind of like voluntarism for the elites and what did you call it? Pacifism for the working class or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think that was my own original formulation,
Take it, take
but
it.
but yeah, I think that's, and again, for people today who are go online, they want to learn about radical ideas, and they find YouTube producers who are offering Marxism-Leninism. I would just really caution that there's an enormous tradition of alternative critical Marxism that is really where people should look, I think, rather than to Marxism-Leninism for a theory that can understand the world and guide efforts to change it.
Right. So in the book, then you spend a long time dealing with the Russian Revolution, and then you look at a few other case studies for these actually existing socialists. Yeah, I don't like the term, the AES. We're stuck with it, I suppose. You use a kind of a capital C and a small c communist, which I think is a better distinction. But can you maybe talk about the equivalent, so the same kind of tendencies that played out in China, one of your other kind of major case studies?
So in China, what happened was fundamentally different than the USSR in the sense that in Russia, you'd had a revolution, workers' revolution, supported by the peasantry, opening up, pointing towards a transition towards a classless and stateless society of freedom. In other words, communism, even if that couldn't, be, if there really weren't steps taken in that direction, but the door was opened. And then that is destroyed in the process eventually of modernizing counter-revolution. But in China, what happens, you have a social revolution, 1949, a social revolution against the form of class society that existed in China, which was both capitalist and non-capitalist or pre-capitalist elements. But it was a social revolution that got overthrew the old landlord and capitalist ruling class and created from the beginning a new ruling class organized through the Communist Party. So this is a revolution that really took the form of a war that did destroy the old state, but then again, from the beginning, the party was fully in control. You did not have the new forms of workers and peasants democracy that had emerged at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. And so this revolution then led to the reorganization of society, eventually essentially along the lines of the USSR, rather than having this kind of process of counter-revolution the way that it happened in Russia.
You've got some very kind of extraordinary details in there, like again, Mao setting quotas for executions from 50 to 53, where 700,000 counter-revolutionaries were killed. Or China's kind of crazy. The statistics you hear about China when there's so many people, in 1960, there was between 12 and 20 million in labor camps. It's quite a ridiculous gap, a spread, an estimate. Do you think China was more of a case of national liberation more than a social revolution?
Well, I think it was both. I think it was both absolutely a national liberation war, because China had been very much, dominated in some ways by Western powers and by Japan. So the national liberation was crucial, and what people in China talk about is the ending of the century of humiliation, which had begun with the so-called Opium Wars in the middle of the 1800s. What the British did to China. But there was also, there's a class struggle against the landlord capitalist ruling class, but one which is under the leadership of a party whose idea of socialism is the USSR. So I think there's both of those, this overwhelmingly peasant class war and national liberation struggle together.
So now it's Commander Xi with his socialism with Chinese characteristics. I kind of sometimes wonder, what would people say? Could people say it seriously if Ireland, for example, had said with its socialism with Irish characteristics? Like, sometimes when these states are so big, it can feel like they're saying something real, but in reality, it's just such non-theoretical rubbish.
Oh yeah, I mean that whatever passes for theory produced by the Chinese Communist Party today doesn't, does not deserve to be taken seriously. Although unfortunately, you find some people on the left, like the editors of the Journal Monthly Review, for example, who will publish this kind of stuff as if it's serious Marxism, which it's not. It's elaborate rationalizations for I think an extremely dynamic and successful project of capitalist development carried out by the Chinese Communist Party, which we could talk about. But it's serious Maoists are horrified by this, right? People who actually have allegiance to the project that was carried through in the 50s and 60s can see this as clearly China is obviously capitalist by any understanding of capitalism, really. If you're not going to engage in some kind of special pleading to try to rationalize the definition of the society as something else, which unfortunately some people do. We have to understand that in terms of the kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend impulse, which is strong on the left, but that's maybe taking us into a somewhat different part of the conversation.
Yeah. Everybody's my enemy. No, I'm joking. But so you also do a kind of a study of another kind of a slightly different, actually existing socialist state, the Cuban Revolution, with more of a guerrilla revolution. Do you want to talk about this again in the same context of where they end up?
Right. So, this is a situation where, interestingly, Cuba, you have more capitalist development than you had in either China or Russia in the 1950s. But, it's very much under the thumb of the United States and ruled by Batista, a dictator. But it's a very weak regime, and it's toppled without, there's a struggle. 1958, 1959 eventually overthrows the Batista regime, but it's not one in which there's a high level of popular participation. In fact, the level of popular involvement in the struggle was higher in 1933 when a revolution happened in Cuba that didn't go very far compared to what happened at the end of the 1950s. And so the people who lead that revolution against Batista, some of them are Marxist-Leninists, but most of them are not. They're, radical nationalists, but they end up, because of the circumstances in which Cuba finds itself within a number of years, turning society, declaring that this is a socialist revolution and adopting the form of socialism that, as understood by the USSR. So it's a revolution which absolutely, gets rid of the imperial domination of Cuba by the US, and so resources that would have otherwise been drained out of the country are then taken, control of by the state and used for the purposes of national economic development. But again, it's the recreation of the so-called socialist form of organizing society rather than a revolution that opens up the possibility of something else.
The story in kind of like Marx and Engels talking about the working class seizing the means of production, that the industrialization would break down class division and the state power or whatever. What has history taught us about industrialization under the whip hand of a Marxist-Leninist, inverted commas, communist state?
Well, certainly it should be. I mean, I hope it's clear. It should be clear, often not, but that the development of productive forces, industrialization, there's nothing inherently communist about that. And to the extent that people identify the development of the productive forces with communism, they actually, I mean, it's a bourgeois understanding of communism, right? Because absolutely, I mean, the situation today is so different from the situation in the middle of the 1800s. in the sense that capitalism has developed extraordinary productive forces, but in a way that is ecologically extraordinarily devastating. And of course, it's done in a highly uneven way because of the imperialist character of global capitalism. But the idea that industrialization carried out through state property is somehow inherently moving society towards a classless and stateless society of freedom is completely false. We need to really, I think, reject the idea that state ownership is in and of itself emancipatory, and the development of productive forces is not by itself evidence that China, for example, today is moving towards communism, which is what its defenders would say. Marx and Engels, right, note that in the Communist Manifesto, they talk about how incredibly dynamic capitalism is in developing productive forces in a way that previous societies hadn't done, but that doesn't mean that they're endorsing capitalism.
And there's a line, definitely, I think it's Engels and I'm sure it's Marx as well, where they explicitly say that nationalization is not socialization.
Yeah, and I quote a couple of those kinds of quotations from Marx and Engels and Connolly and others in the book, just to kind of give a sense that even though before the Russian Revolution, no one imagined a society like no one imagined a society like the USSR was possible, but the idea that state ownership was inherently communist was certainly foreign to many communists. So that the idea that there was always that other tradition needs to be understood. If you look at Marx and Engels, if you look at William Morris, Rosa Luxemburg, and so on, I think that's very clear.
We've just kind of gone through and trashed all the actually existing states in under an hour. So, like, in the book, you deal with like people objecting to this kind of critique. This critique I have, and I think that we share, is not from a place of like just criticism or something. It comes from a place of emancipating the working class and what that implies. What are these critiques then we get then from, say, people who look fondly on these kind of Marxist-Leninist societies? How do we deal with these objections?
Well, I try in the book to actually lay them out because I think it's helpful to actually take the challenges to my own position and to try to engage with them. I hope it helps readers to recognize these other points of view when they encounter them, so they can identify them for what they are. Well, there's probably the most common one is simply denunciation, which says that's just anti-communist. The idea that any kind of critique of the what I would say is small c communist critique of the kind that I'm making of the so-called social societies, that just gets equated with anti-communism, as if what I'm arguing is the same as what liberals or social democrats or conservatives would argue. I mean, I guess the thing to say there is that a lot of the defenders of those societies, what they do is they redefine communism in a way, communist politics, and they take it back to pre-Marxist idea where the transition towards communism is not a process which has to be controlled by ordinary people, by the direct producers, ourselves, and a process where you can have a strengthening of the rule of the state over people. And that's really a reversion to the kind of communism that Marx and Engels broke from, along with their co-thinkers in the 1840s. I mean, we've touched on this idea of the productive forces, but, the Communist Manifesto says that capitalism has accomplished wonders in terms of the development of productive forces. But that doesn't mean that Marx and Engels supported capitalism. And so people who say that these societies were moving towards communism because they developed the productive forces, that just completely avoids the question of what's the social character of production in those societies. Production to what end? Is it in fact carried out by, to use Marx's phrase, the associated producers democratically themselves? Is that what planning looks like, or is it carried out on their behalf by others? And this argument that those societies were simply because they developed the productive forces necessarily supposedly moving towards communism, there's no understanding of alienated labor and the process of moving beyond alienated labor in that approach either. Then there are also people who are anti-Stalinist, who are very critical of these societies, but who argue that because there was state ownership of the means of production, necessarily they would say that there had to be a transition to communism that had at least begun, even if it was then blocked by bureaucracy. And there are comrades who sincerely hold this position, and some of them are people who'd be revolutionary opponents of Stalinism. But I think that that position, certainly associated with Trotsky and most Trotskyists, it does not come to grips with the question of what were the relations of production in these societies. That's simply talking about state ownership does not explain what the relations of production actually were. That's what we need to analyze. That's what the book tries to analyze. I have to ask the question, how was production organized? To what ends was it organized? And by whom was it organized? State ownership is simply a formal, institutional, legal setup. It doesn't actually explain the social character of production. There are also some people who simply say, well, yes, you're right, it was awful in all sorts of ways, but it was still better than capitalism because there were good things there. Like, so Cuba has better healthcare and of course, it's true that in Cuba there was much better healthcare than elsewhere in the region. In fact, much better healthcare than you get in many advanced capitalist societies, although it's much worse now than it used to be. And we can acknowledge those things as facts without then leaping to the idea that we have to defend the whole social order. Just like, in Britain, people need to defend the NHS, or at least the remnants of the NHS that are still the better elements of it. But that doesn't mean you're defending British society as a whole, just because even at its, it doesn't mean that in the 1950s and 1960s, when the NHS was in its original form, that somehow that meant that Britain wasn't anything other than a capitalist society. So we can acknowledge those kinds of realities without endorsing the society. As when you look at the mode of production in those societies, we can say, well, there's a debate about exactly what mode of production it was, but it certainly wasn't better than capitalism, even if we are legitimate disagreements about the specific character of that society, but it certainly wasn't a more advanced social order.
Yeah, my co-author Donald, when he first moved over to Russia, he was interested in talking to some of the older people about the Soviet Union, just regular people, and he'd ask, he said the first time he felt so stupid, like he was asking someone, he said, what was like work like in under the Soviet times? And they looked at him quizzically, like, what do you mean? And he was like, was it different? And they're like, what are you talking about? It was just exactly the same. They were just going in and getting a wage and going home. And you had the same boss worker relationship. It was like, we can say there might have been differences on the side with the planning and all blah, 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 and how it worked. But in essence, it was exactly the same.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, because this comes up when sometimes people talk about it, that of course, after the fall of the USSR, the collapse of the USSR, and in the 90s, there was with the privatization, the so-called thought shock therapy, there was a dramatic deterioration in the living standards of people in the USSR, right? That's undeniable. But the idea that that fact somehow means that one should politically defend the social order that existed before that, it's just completely illogical. Just like you can talk about Latin America, various countries where living standards were slashed dramatically, that turned to neoliberal policies, and that doesn't mean that you have to defend state import industrialization and the policies of the previous regime. It was more dramatic in the USSR, but we can absolutely acknowledge the devastation that people experienced in the 90s and all the horrors of Russia today without endorsing the Stalinist social order.
Right. No more than like somebody in Russia today needs to support Putin because the economy is doing better than it was in the 1990s when he came to power.
Right.
I think if we look at, I think people were correct about the actually existing socialist states, that they were transitional states. What people get wrong is that they were actually transitional from whatever type of mode of production we want to call it. Everybody has their own opinions, but they were transitional to capitalism,
Mm.
and that's the point.
Yeah, the bulk of the argument in my book is to argue that these societies were never in transition towards communism, and that there was a ruling class. There was alienated labor, there was class exploitation and oppression. And I think there are two strong interpretations. One would be to argue that these societies were a non-capitalist form of class exploitation. What I argue in the book, I find more persuasive, is the idea that they were a distorted form of capitalism. And that's a debate that certainly we can have. But I think the more important argument is to be very clear about what these societies were not, i.e. in transition to communism, and to understand that there was class rule, class exploitation in these societies.
You also do a bit of a critique of the Popular Front as strategy for revolution. I was wondering if you could go into that a bit more.
Okay, so I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'm happy to pick up on it. So the whole idea of a popular front strategy, again, you would find this today is the basis of the political programs of parties like the Communist Party in Britain and the CPB and others. Is that so the first premise is that the current stage of the struggle is one of either we call like an anti-monopoly stage or a democratic stage. Sometimes people today would talk about it as anti-fascist. And the idea is that at this stage, there needs to be the construction of the widest possible block of social forces, which would extend from people who are anti-capitalist on the left all the way through to so-called progressive wing of the ruling class that would be anti-fascist, so-called, or committed to liberal democracy, something like that. And then at some future stage, so this is strategy that's supposedly appropriate to the current stage, and at some future stage, you can actually talk about anti-capitalist or socialist politics, or the possibility of a struggle for socialism. Almost always a stage theory involved. And in the current stage, then you need to try to construct this kind of broad array of forces. That means necessarily not going to be done on the basis of a consistent approach to class struggle, because there has to be a watering down of the politics. There has to be done on a more minimal programmatic basis in order to incorporate the middle class and actual capitalist forces that need to be included in this broad democratic alliance. So that's classic kind of popular front politics, and it's both influential on a smaller scale in its traditional forms through communist parties and similar groups. And then without necessarily using the language, you also find that very influential in lots of countries today where people are faced with the genuinely frightening threat of the far right. And they figure, well, we need to stop, whether it's Tommy Robinson or Farage or Donald Trump or whoever it is, this idea of the widest possible unity and going beyond the idea that you want to bring together very fragmented working class and some people who are in the middle class who are prepared to be part of the struggle, but actually going beyond that and saying that there's a progressive capitalists, right? So whatever the capitalists in the US that are opposed to Trump, that they're supposedly the progressive wing of the capitalist class, and that people in the US should offer critical support to the Democratic Party in order to stop Trump. Those kinds of politics. That's really what the Popular Front looks like, and I just think that that's different from a politics in the tradition of the United Front, which is an idea from earlier in the history of the communist movement. So the Popular Front's really codified in the middle of the 1930s, but earlier, the idea of a united front, which would try to unite working class forces in the struggle around immediate objectives, whether that be higher wages and better working conditions or fighting fascism. But the key thing is that you're not trying to actually include any section of the ruling class in that alliance. I think that's the key distinction. Now, I think there's a caveat here, and that is, so I'm clearly very critical of the Popular Front strategy, but we also can't just sort of recycle the United Front as it was formulated in the early 1920s for the situation today, because that was a strategy to try to bring together small revolutionary socialist forces with much larger reformist left forces in a situation where you had the classical workers movement that just doesn't exist today in the same form. But I think that thinking with and creatively trying to work with that kind of approach, trying to unite the working class in all its genuine breadth and diversity around immediate struggles, to defend oppressed people, to fight the far right, to try to fight to improve living standards, to take on climate justice demands, all those kinds of things that's a very fruitful approach, more fruitful than the Popular Front, because I do think as soon as you start trying to include any section of the ruling class in the alliance, the inevitable result is going to be the subordination of working class demands and so on to try to draw in or keep those other people in the alliance.
Yeah, particularly if the bourgeoisie elements control the purse strings. My partner here was doing some voluntary work for, I think it's the Black History Archives in Brixton here in London. And like they made the decision like years and years ago. I don't know how old they are. I think they're like 30, 40, 50 years old, that they made the decision never to take like the local council money and to only fundraise for themselves. And so they can control their politics, right? And they're way more radical for the fact.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question of not taking state funding, which is a huge issue for nonprofits and so on. Yeah, I mean, it's politically very important. It's a more difficult road to go, but I think, as you say, it allows people to maintain their independence from the local state.
Is there anything then, David, that we haven't covered about the book that you would like to say to finish up?
No, I think we probably covered the essentials, and I thank you for your interest in it.
Do you want to tell everybody about your podcast?
Oh, okay. So I host a socialist podcast called Victor's Children. So it's named after Victor Serge, who is an important writer who started as an anarchist, became a Bolshevik, became a Trotskyist, became a kind of an independent anti-Stalinist. He has a brilliant set of memoirs, Memoirs of a Revolutionary, which everybody should read, and novels and other works. So I've always found him inspirational. And so, yeah, Victor's Children is a podcast monthly that looks at a variety of political, theoretical, sometimes historical questions. So I'm based in the Canadian state, but so some of the episodes focus on more Canadian questions, but lots of them are of interest to people all over the world, I think, in terms of the international ones that are looked at. And people can find that on any of the major apps and so on, or on SoundCloud.
Yeah, I only literally came across it there after I read your book. I was looking for your contact details and I came across it. So I've been going through the back episode. So it's very good. There's a really good one on dialectics with David McNally. That's a really
Yes,
excellent episode.
it is. In fact, it's the most listened to episode of the podcast. So I
Yeah.
think people looking for a clear, non-simplistic but clear explanation of dialectics would definitely want to check that out.
Yeah, that's an impossible bar you just described. No, I'm only joking. No, it's really, really good. I think he actually does it. A brilliant job at it. Well, David, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much.